Picture this, an empire that rose from the dust of Mesopotamia, commanding armies of elite chariot warriors, so feared even the mighty pharaohs of Egypt sought their alliance. An empire whose kings spoke a language so unique, so alien, it vanished almost without a trace, leaving scholars to piece together its secrets like a cosmic jigsaw puzzle. You think you know ancient history? Think again, because tonight we're diving into the shadowy world of the Mitanni, and trust me, it's a wild ride. Hey everyone, what's up? It's your favorite history nerd, back at it again. And tonight, folks, buckle up or maybe unbuckle, get comfy, because we're going deep. We're not just scratching the surface, we're excavating the unvarnished truth, the nitty-gritty details about a kingdom that most textbooks probably gave you half a paragraph on, if you were lucky. We're talking about the Mitanni, the chariot maestros, the diplomatic power players of the late Bronze Age. A civilization that held its own against Egypt, the Hittites, and the rising tide of Assyria. We'll uncover their badass warriors, their strange gods, their even stranger language, and the political drama that would make Game of Thrones look like a PTA meeting. So, if you dig this kind of deep dive, if you're into the real story, the stuff they don't teach you in school, do your boy a solid. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already. Seriously, what are you waiting for? And ding that notification bell so you don't miss our next trip down the historical rabbit hole. And hey, drop a comment below right now. What's the one ancient empire you wish you knew more about? Let me know. Alright, now for the real reason some of you are here. Dim those lights, find your comfy spot, maybe grab a warm drink. We're about to embark on a long journey back in time, about 3,500 years to be precise. Let the story wash over you. No sudden jump scares, I promise. Well, maybe a few historical oh damn moments, but nothing your sleepy brain can't handle. So where do we even begin with a kingdom as enigmatic as Mitanni? A kingdom that for a while was one of the undisputed heavyweights of the Near East. Only to fade into near obscurity. Let's set the stage. Imagine a world teetering on the brink of colossal change. A world of bronze gods and incredibly high-stakes diplomacy. Welcome to the late Bronze Age and the rise of the Hurrian chariot lords. Imagine you're standing in what is now northern Syria and southeastern Turkey. It's hot, dusty. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers snake through the landscape, the lifeblood of civilizations for millennia. This is the heartland of Mitanni. Not quite Babylon, not quite Egypt, but a crucial crossroads. Think of it like the crucial swing state in an ancient presidential election. Everyone wants a piece of it. The Egyptians called this region Naharan, the land of rivers, and boy did those rivers matter. Water meant agriculture. Agriculture meant wealth, and wealth meant power. The fertile plains between these waterways were perfect for growing barley and wheat, raising cattle, and most importantly for our story, breeding the finest horses in the known world. But here's the thing about geography in the ancient Near East. It was both a blessing and a curse. Sure, you had fertile land and trade routes, but you also had everyone and their mother wanting to control those same resources. Mitanni found itself smack dab in the middle of what was essentially the ancient world's most contested real estate. Picture the landscape, rolling hills dotted with fortified cities, rivers cutting silver paths through golden fields. And in the distance, the dust clouds of approaching armies, or maybe just really important diplomatic missions. Hard to tell the difference sometimes. The summers were brutal, the winters could be harsh, and the politics, even more brutal than the weather. This wasn't some remote backwater kingdom hiding in the mountains. This was prime territory, sitting astride the major trade routes between Anatolia and Mesopotamia, between the emerging Hittite Empire to the north, and the established powers of Babylon and Assyria to the south. If you wanted to move goods, armies, or ideas between these regions, you probably had to deal with Mitanni in some way. The cities that dotted this landscape had names that roll off the tongue like ancient poetry, Washukani, their mysterious capital, that archaeologists still haven't definitively located, talk about playing hard to get. Arafah, modern-day Kirkuk in Iraq. Nuzi, where we've found some fascinating archives that give us glimpses into daily life. These weren't just dots on a map. They were thriving urban centers connected by a web of political, economic, and cultural ties. So who are the stars of our show? The Hurrians. And honestly, we're still scratching our heads about where exactly they popped up from. It's like that one cousin who shows up at Thanksgiving. Nobody knows their full backstory, but they make really good dip and somehow end up running the entire family gathering. That's the Hurrians, enigmatic, but definitely important. Here's what we do know: they weren't Semitic like the Babylonians or Assyrians. They weren't Indo-European like the Hittites or later the Persians. They were something else entirely. A linguistic island in a sea of more familiar language families. Some scholars think they might have migrated from the Caucasus region, that mountainous area between the Black and Caspian Seas. Others suggest they might have been there all along, indigenous to the region, but somehow flying under the historical radar until they suddenly weren't. The truth is probably messier than any clean migration theory. Ancient populations didn't move in neat, organized waves like we see in history textbooks. They trickled, they merged, they conquered, they intermarried, they adopted each other's gods and forgot each other's languages. The Hurrians who formed the core of Mitanni were likely the result of centuries of this kind of cultural mixing and matching. What made them distinctive wasn't necessarily their ethnicity. That's a modern concept that doesn't map well onto ancient identities anyway, but their language, their religious practices, and eventually their military innovations. They had their own pantheon of gods, their own way of organizing society, and their own approach to the art of war. But here's where it gets really interesting. While the bulk of the population was Hurrian, the ruling elite of Mitanni had some distinctly non-Hurrian characteristics. Names that sounded suspiciously Indo-Aryan, gods borrowed from what would become the Vedic pantheon of India, horse training terminology that wouldn't sound out of place in ancient Sanskrit. It's like discovering that the founding fathers of America were secretly into K-pop. Mind-bending right. This has led to all sorts of wild theories. Did a small group of Indo-Aryan warriors migrate to the region and become the ruling class? Were these just cultural borrowings like how English has absorbed words from dozens of languages? Or is there some deeper connection we're missing? The honest answer is we don't know. And that uncertainty is part of what makes the Mitanni so fascinating. Before Mitanni became Mitanni, the Hurrians were kind of like indie bands playing in local clubs. You'd hear whispers, see their names on a few festival posters, aka ancient cuneiform tablets, but they weren't headliners yet. The earliest mentions of Hurrians go back to around 2500 BCE, scattered references in Mesopotamian texts that treat them as semi-nomadic peoples on the periphery of civilization. Not exactly the stuff of legends, they were the kind of people that established empires, noticed when they needed mercenaries, or when they were causing trouble on the borders, but otherwise ignored. But then the Bronze Age world went through one of its periodic shakeups. The old Babylonian Empire, the one ruled by the famous lawgiver Hammurabi, collapsed under pressure from various directions. The Kassites. Another mystery. People seriously, the Bronze Age was full of these enigmatic groups swept down and took control of Babylon. The power vacuum was enormous. Picture the ancient Near East around 1600 BCE as a geopolitical game of musical chairs, except when the music stopped, there weren't enough seats for everyone and some of the players had chariot armies. Into this chaos stepped the Hurrians, not as conquerors necessarily, but as organizers. They had been watching, learning, adapting. When the opportunity came, they were ready. It wasn't an overnight transformation. The rise of Mitanni was more like a slow-burn success story, the kind where you look back and realize that the quiet kid in class had been building a business empire while everyone else was focused on drama. City by city, alliance by alliance, the Hurrians began to coalesce into something larger than the sum of their parts. The key was timing. They emerged just as military technology was undergoing a revolution, the widespread adoption of horse-drawn chariots. This wasn't just about having better weapons. It was about having a completely new way of thinking about warfare speed and mobility. The Hurrians didn't invent the chariot, but they perfected the art of using it. It's like trying to keep track of P. Diddy's name changes. The Egyptians called it Naharian. The Assyrians called it Hanigalbat. The Mitanni themselves, well, that's part of the fun. This isn't just a kingdom, it's an identity crisis in cuneiform. Each name tells us something about how different cultures perceived this kingdom. To the Egyptians focused on the rivers that made the region valuable, it was Naharan, the land of rivers. Makes sense from their perspective considering Egypt's entire civilization was built around the predictable flooding of the Nile. Rivers meant everything to them. The Assyrians used Hanigalbat, which might have been closer to what the inhabitants actually called their homeland. But even this gets complicated because Assyrian records span centuries and they weren't always talking about the same political entity. Sometimes Hanigalbat referred to the kingdom at its height, sometimes to its rump state remnants, and sometimes to the Assyrian province that replaced it. The name Mitanni itself is interesting. It appears in some of their own texts, but it might have referred specifically to the ruling dynasty rather than the kingdom as a whole. Imagine if future historians called the United States the Washington after the founding family, and you get an idea of how this might work. This multiplicity of names isn't just academic confusion, it reflects the complex reality of ancient political identity. Modern nations have clear borders, official languages, and standardized currencies. Ancient kingdoms were often more like confederations of city-states, tribal groups, and regional powers held together by personal loyalty to a king's shared religious practices or simple military dominance. The Mitanni kingdom probably looked different depending on where you stood. From the Egyptian court in Memphis, it was that powerful northern neighbor you had to deal with diplomatically. From an Assyrian merchant's perspective, it might have been a collection of cities and trade routes to navigate. From a Hurrian farmer's point of view, it was probably just the local authority that collected taxes and occasionally demanded military service. But whatever you called it, by around 1500 BCE, this entity had become impossible to ignore. It controlled territory from the Euphrates to the Zagros Mountains, commanded respect from the great powers of the age, and was about to enter its golden age as one of the premier military and diplomatic forces in the ancient world. The rise from obscurity was complete. The Hurrians had arrived on the world stage, and they were driving chariots. Close your eyes. Hear the thunder of 100 hooves, the creak of leather and wood, the whir of arrows. Feel the ground shake. This wasn't just transportation. This was the F-16 of the Bronze Age. Fast, deadly, and utterly terrifying if you were an infantry grunt on the receiving end. Now let's be clear, the Mitanni didn't invent the chariot. That honor probably goes to someone in the steppes around 2000 BCE, maybe earlier. But claiming the Mitanni weren't innovative because they didn't invent chariots is like saying the Wright brothers weren't important because humans had been dreaming of flight for centuries. Innovation isn't always about creating something from nothing. Sometimes it's about taking an existing idea and perfecting it to such a degree that you change the world. And that's exactly what the Mitanni did. They took the relatively clunky heavy chariots that had been lumbering around battlefields for centuries and turned them into precision instruments of war. The secret was in the details: lighter construction using carefully selected woods, strategic use of leather and bronze fittings, and most importantly, the development of spoked wheels instead of solid ones. Imagine trying to fight a Formula One car with a pointy stick. That's pretty much the vibe when Mitanni chariots showed up on a battlefield dominated by traditional infantry formations. The psychological impact alone must have been devastating. You're standing in your neat little shield wall feeling pretty confident about your bronze spear and leather armor when suddenly the horizon fills with dust clouds and the drumbeat of hooves. The Mitanni chariot was typically pulled by 2 horses, carefully bred, expertly trained animals that were worth more than most people's houses. The chariot itself was a marvel of Bronze Age, engineering a lightweight platform that could carry 2 men at speeds that would make ancient infantry wet themselves. The driver, whose job was infinitely more complex than it sounds, and the archer, whose job was to hit moving targets while bouncing around on what was essentially a very fast, very unstable platform. The arrows were the real killer, literally. Mitanni archers could loose arrow after arrow while their chariots wheeled around enemy formations, staying just out of range of return fire. It was like being attacked by a swarm of very fast, very angry wasps, except the wasps had bronze-tipped stingers and excellent tactical coordination. But the real genius of Mitanni chariot warfare wasn't just the technology, it was the tactics. They didn't use chariots like tanks trying to smash through enemy lines. That's what less sophisticated armies did, and it usually ended with a lot of dead horses and smashed chariots. Instead, the Mitanni used them like fighter jets, hit-and-run attacks, flanking maneuvers, harassment of supply lines, and psychological warfare. And who were driving these ancient death machines? The Marianu. Think of them as a cross between medieval knights, Formula One drivers, and a very exclusive country club. These weren't your average Joes. This was an elite warrior aristocracy, born and bred for chariot warfare. The word Marianu itself is fascinating. It might come from an Indo-Aryan term meaning young warrior, which would fit perfectly with our picture of these guys as an elite military class with some kind of Indo-Aryan cultural influence. Or it might be purely Hurrian. Honestly, the etymology is about as clear as mud, but the important thing is what they represented: the absolute pinnacle of Bronze Age military sophistication. Becoming a Marianu wasn't something you could just decide to do one day. This was a hereditary class passed down from father to son like a very dangerous family business. Training started young, we're talking childhood. By the time a Marianu reached fighting age, he had spent years learning not just how to fight, but how to fight from a moving platform while controlling 2 highly strung war horses and coordinating with dozens of other chariots in complex battle formations. The investment required to maintain a single Marianu warrior was staggering. The chariot itself was a precision instrument that required constant maintenance by skilled craftsmen. The horses needed specialized care training, and feeding war horses eat a lot, and not just any grass would do. The weapons and armor had to be of the highest quality. The Marianu needed support staff, grooms, armorers, drivers in training, spare horses. Think about it this way. Maintaining a Marianu warrior was roughly equivalent to a modern military, maintaining a fighter pilot complete with aircraft ground crew and all the associated infrastructure. It was expensive, complex, and absolutely essential if you wanted to compete at the highest levels of Bronze Age warfare. But it wasn't just about the cost, it was about the culture. The Marianu weren't just soldiers. They were the social elite of Mitanni society. They owned land, they had political influence, they married into the royal family. Being a Marianu meant you were someone who mattered, someone whose opinion carried weight in the halls of power. This created an interesting dynamic. On one hand, you had a military elite that was absolutely essential to the kingdom's survival and prosperity. On the other hand, you had a group of people who knew exactly how essential they were and weren't shy about leveraging that knowledge for political and economic advantage. It's a tension that would play out in various forms throughout Mitanni's history. Their playbook wasn't subtle. It was shock and awe, Bronze Age style. Picture a swarm of these chariots appearing over the horizon, dust billowing, arrows flying. Most armies would just, nope, right out of there. It's like showing up to a knife fight with a bazooka. The Mitanni approach to battle was fundamentally different from the slugged-out infantry warfare that had dominated the Bronze Age up to that point. Traditional battles were often grinding affairs of attrition, where victory went to whoever could maintain their formation longest, while steadily wearing down the enemy. The Mitanni turned this on its head with a doctrine built around speed, mobility, and psychological warfare. A typical Mitanni battle plan would start long before the actual fighting began. Intelligence gathering was crucial. They needed to know enemy numbers, positions, morale, and most importantly, the terrain. Chariots were useless in swamps, forests, or mountains. They needed open ground, preferably with good visibility and room to maneuver. When battle was joined, the Mitanni would typically open with what we might call shock and awe tactics. Imagine you're a foot soldier in an enemy army, standing in your neat formation, when suddenly the air fills with the sound of thundering hooves and war cries. Clouds of dust appear on multiple horizons, not just one direction, but several. The Mitanni chariots would attack from multiple angles simultaneously, making the enemy force feel surrounded and outnumbered, even when they weren't. The arrows would start falling before you could even see the chariots clearly. Bronze-tipped death raining down from what seemed like everywhere at once. And just when you think you've identified where the attack is coming from, the chariots wheel away only to be replaced by another wave from a different direction. It's death by 1,000 cuts, psychological warfare, and physical destruction working hand in hand. But the real genius was in what came next. Most armies faced with this kind of harassment would either break and run, in which case the Mitanni could hunt them down at leisure, or they would try to charge the chariots and restore close combat where their superior numbers might matter. The Mitanni were ready for both responses. If the enemy broke, the chariots transformed into pursuit vehicles running down fleeing soldiers with ruthless efficiency. If the enemy charged, the chariots would conduct a fighting withdrawal, drawing the enemy infantry away from their preferred formations and into terrain where they could be destroyed piecemeal. Yeah, being an infantryman back then when you heard the Mitanni were coming, probably a good time to update your will if they had wills, or paper, or a concept of updating. You can't have chariots without horses, Captain Obvious. And the Mitanni were obsessed with their horses. We even have a horse training manual from a Mitanni guy named Kikli. It's like horse whispering for dummies, from 1345 BCE. And here's where it gets really weird. Some of their horse-related words, and even some of their gods' names, sound Indo-Aryan, like from ancient India. How the heck did that happen? It's like finding out your hardcore Texan BBQ pitmaster secretly listens to K-pop. Mind-blowing, right? The Kikli text is one of the most remarkable documents to survive from the ancient world. Found at Hattusa, the Hittite capital, it's a detailed manual for training chariot horses, written by a Mitanni horse master. And when scholars first translated it, they got the shock of their academic lives. The technical terminology, words for specific training periods, numbers, even some of the commands were clearly related to Sanskrit, the ancient Indo-Aryan language. We're talking about terms like Ikavartana, which corresponds to Sanskrit Ekavartana, meaning one turn. Panchavartana, relating to Sanskrit Panchavartana, meaning 5 turns. These aren't coincidences or vague similarities, they're clearly related words from the same linguistic family. But it gets weirder. The gods invoked in Mitanni treaties include Mitra, Varuna, Indra, and the Nasatya twins, all straight out of the Vedic pantheon that would later become central to Hinduism. These aren't minor local deities that happen to have similar names. These are major gods with similar attributes and roles. So what the hell was going on? How did Indo-Aryan religious and technical terminology end up in the court language of a Hurrian kingdom in northern Mesopotamia? The theories range from the plausible to the absolutely wild. One possibility is a small-scale migration of Indo-Aryan elites who became the ruling class of a predominantly Hurrian population. Picture a group of horse warrior aristocrats from somewhere in the Iranian plateau or Central Asia, probably no more than a few hundred families, who managed to establish themselves as the dominant military force in the region through their superior chariot technology and horsemanship. Another theory suggests it was cultural borrowing on a massive scale. Maybe the Mitanni imported not just horses and chariots, but the entire cultural complex associated with them, including the terminology, training methods, and religious practices. It would be like a modern country not just buying fighter jets, but adopting the entire military culture of the country that made them. The reality was probably some combination of both, complicated by centuries of cultural mixing that we can barely reconstruct from the fragmentary evidence that survives. What we can say is that horses were absolutely central to Mitanni identity and power, and that the Indo-Aryan elements in their culture were clearly connected to this horse-centered worldview. The breeding and training of war horses was serious business in the Mitanni kingdom. These weren't just any horses, they were carefully selected animals bred for speed, endurance, and the right temperament for warfare. A good warhorse had to be fast enough to outrun infantry, strong enough to pull a chariot and its crew all day, brave enough not to panic in battle, and intelligent enough to respond to subtle commands while arrows were flying. The Mitanni became the go-to source for high-quality horses throughout the ancient Near East. Egyptian pharaohs paid enormous sums for Mitanni horses. Hittite kings negotiated for breeding stock. Even the Assyrians, who would eventually destroy the Mitanni kingdom, acknowledged their expertise in horse breeding and training. This gave the Mitanni a massive economic advantage beyond just military dominance. They were essentially running the ancient equivalent of a high-tech weapons manufacturing industry, complete with closely guarded trade secrets and extensive international customers. No wonder they could afford to maintain such an expensive military system. The horses were paying for themselves. Okay, nerds assemble. Let's talk language. The main language of Mitanni was Hurrian, and if you think learning Spanish was hard, try Hurrian. It's not related to English or Latin or Hebrew or Egyptian. It's like the platypus of ancient languages, a total oddball. Hurrian belongs to what linguists call a language isolate, which is fancy academic speak, for we have no idea what it's related to, if anything. It's like discovering a completely new species of animal that doesn't fit into any known family tree. In a region where most languages belong to well-established families, Semitic languages like Akkadian and Hebrew, or Indo-European languages like Hittite and later Persian Hurrian, was doing its own thing entirely. The grammar alone is enough to make your head spin. While most languages you might be familiar with follow what linguists call a nominative-accusative pattern, where the subject of the sentence gets one marking and the object gets another, Hurrian used an ergative-absolutive system. This means that the subject of an intransitive verb and the object of a transitive verb get the same marking, while the subject of a transitive verb gets a different one. If that sounds confusing, congratulations, you're beginning to understand what scholars have been dealing with for the past century. It's like trying to learn a language where the rules are not just different, but organized according to completely different principles from anything you've ever encountered. Trying to learn Hurrian grammar from the few scraps we have is like trying to assemble IKEA furniture with instructions written in Klingon while blindfolded and drunk during an earthquake. The vocabulary is equally challenging. While languages often borrow words from their neighbors, English has snatched vocabulary from pretty much every language it's ever encountered. Hurrian seems to have been relatively resistant to borrowing, at least in its core vocabulary. The words for basic concepts like family relationships, body parts, and common activities are distinctly Hurrian, with no clear parallels in neighboring languages. This linguistic isolation makes Hurrian both fascinating and frustrating for modern scholars. Every new text discovered provides valuable clues, but often raises as many questions as it answers. It's like working on a jigsaw puzzle where most of the pieces are missing. You're not sure what the final picture is supposed to look like, and you suspect someone might have mixed in pieces from several different puzzles. But here's what makes it even more interesting. Despite being a linguistic isolate, Hurrian was incredibly successful as a prestige language in the ancient Near East. It wasn't just spoken in the Mitanni Heartland. Hurrian texts have been found throughout the region from Anatolia to the Levant. This suggests that learning Hurrian was seen as sophisticated, useful, or necessary for anyone involved in high-level diplomacy or culture. So, how do we even know anything about this linguistic ghost? Thank the Egyptians and their pack rat tendencies. We found letters from Mitanni kings to pharaohs, and one of them, a massive bragfest from a king named Tushrada, was mostly in Hurrian. It's our Rosetta Stone, kinda. A very, very confusing Rosetta Stone. The Amarna letters are one of archaeology's greatest treasure troves, discovered in the late 19th century at the site of Akhenaten, the short-lived capital built by the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten. Among the hundreds of cuneiform tablets found there representing diplomatic correspondence between Egypt and various Near Eastern powers, several letters from Mitanni kings stand out for their historical importance and linguistic challenges. The most famous is a letter from King Tushratta to Pharaoh Amenhotep III, written primarily in Hurrian. It's massive, over 500 lines of cuneiform, and covers everything from diplomatic pleasantries to complaints about delayed gold shipments to detailed accounts of Mitanni military victories. For scholars trying to understand Hurrian, it's like finding a novel-length text in a language you're trying to decipher from shopping lists and tombstone inscriptions. But even this treasure trove comes with complications. Ancient diplomatic correspondence followed very specific conventions and formulas, which means a lot of the language is highly specialized and formal. It's like trying to learn modern English from reading nothing but legal contracts and diplomatic cables. You'll learn something, but you might get a very skewed picture of how people actually talked. The breakthrough in Hurrian studies came from bilingual texts, particularly those found at the Hittite capital of Hattusa. The Hittites, probably because they ruled over significant Hurrian-speaking populations, produced a number of texts in both Hittite and Hurrian. These bilingual inscriptions function like translation keys, allowing scholars to match Hurrian words and phrases with their Hittite equivalents. But even this process is fraught with difficulties. Ancient translation wasn't always literal. Sometimes it was more like adaptation or interpretation. Cultural concepts that existed in one language might not have exact equivalents in another. Religious or legal terminology could be particularly tricky, as it often carried cultural baggage that doesn't translate directly. The truth is, we still don't understand Hurrian completely. Scholars can read the general sense of most texts, identify major themes and topics, and understand basic grammar and vocabulary. But subtle nuances, wordplay, poetry, and complex religious or philosophical concepts often remain mysterious. It's like understanding a conversation in a foreign language well enough to follow the main points, but missing the joke's references and deeper meanings. Every new Hurrian text discovered is a cause for celebration in the small, dedicated community of scholars who work on the language. Each one potentially provides new vocabulary, clearer examples of grammatical structures, or insights into Hurrian culture and society. But progress is slow, and there are probably more questions about Hurrian today than there were when scholars first started working on it seriously. Remember those Indo-Aryan words we mentioned? This is where your brain might start to melt a little. Their treaties invoke gods like Indra and Varuna straight out of the Vedic pantheon of ancient India. Their kings sometimes had Indo-Aryan names. What in the Bronze Age cultural appropriation is going on here? Were a bunch of Proto-Indians road-tripping through Mesopotamia and decided to stick around and become chariot overlords? The theories are wild, man. Let's break this down, because it's genuinely one of the most perplexing puzzles in ancient history. We're not talking about vague similarities or coincidental parallels here. The names and terms found in Mitanni texts are clearly unambiguously related to Sanskrit and other Indo-Aryan languages. The gods Mitra, Varuna, Indra, and the divine twins Nasatya appear in a treaty between the Mitanni king Madawaza and the Hittite king Suppiluliuma, dated to around 1380 BCE. These aren't minor local deities or variants with similar names. Mitra, for example, was associated with contracts and oaths in both Vedic religion and Mitanni usage, exactly the kind of god you'd invoke in a treaty. Varuna was connected with water and cosmic order. Indra was a warrior god associated with storms and battles. The Nasatya twins were divine horsemen. The functions and attributes match up too closely to be coincidental. Then, there are the royal names. Several Mitanni kings had clearly Indo-Aryan names: Artatama, Artashumara, Tushratta. These names follow Indo-Aryan naming patterns and contain elements found in Sanskrit. Tushratta, for example, can be analyzed as Tvesharatha, meaning having a splendid chariot perfectly appropriate for a king whose power was based on chariot warfare. The technical terminology is equally striking. Remember that horse training manual by Kickley we mentioned? It's full of numerical terms and technical vocabulary that corresponds closely to Sanskrit. The word for warrior or young man in these contexts seems to be Maryanu, which looks suspiciously like the Sanskrit Marya, meaning young warrior or hero. So what's the explanation? The theories range from the conservative to the revolutionary. At the conservative end, some scholars argue that this is simply cultural borrowing. Maybe the Mitanni imported chariot technology and horsemanship from somewhere further east, and the Indo-Aryan terminology came along as part of the package. It would be like modern countries adopting English terms for computer technology, not because they're English-speaking, but because that's the language the technology developed in. A more dramatic theory suggests that a small elite group of Indo-Aryan speakers migrated to the region and established themselves as a ruling class over the predominantly Hurrian population. This could explain why the Indo-Aryan elements are concentrated in royal names, religious texts, and military terminology, the spheres where this elite would have had the most influence. The wildest theories involve massive population movements, cultural invasions, or even connections to the mysterious sea peoples who disrupted the eastern Mediterranean around this time. Some scholars have suggested that the same population movements that brought Indo-Aryan speakers to India also sent branches westward into the Near East. It wasn't that the entire Mitanni population was Indo-Aryan. Far from it. It seems to be a layer and influence mostly within the ruling class and warrior elite. Like adding saffron to a dish, it changes the flavor, but the base ingredients are still there. So if Hurrian was so unique, why aren't we all speaking it on Duolingo? Well, empires fall, and when Mitanni fell, their language kinda went with it. It got absorbed, diluted, and eventually silenced by the rising linguistic tides of Aramaic and Akkadian. A linguistic tragedy, really. Poof, gone. Like that awesome indie band that breaks up just when they're about to make it big. The death of a language is often a slow, complex process, and Hurrian's decline followed the political collapse of the Mitanni kingdom. As the kingdom fragmented and was eventually absorbed by the Assyrian Empire, Hurrian speakers found themselves under pressure to adopt the languages of their conquerors and new rulers. Akkadian, the Semitic language that served as the diplomatic lingua franca of the ancient Near East, had always been used alongside Hurrian in Mitanni for international correspondence and trade. As Mitanni's political independence disappeared, so did the prestige and practical utility of speaking Hurrian. Why maintain a minority language when advancement and opportunity required fluency in Akkadian or later Aramaic? The process was probably gradual over several generations. First-generation Hurrian speakers under Assyrian rule would have been bilingual by necessity. Their children might have grown up speaking Hurrian at home but Akkadian in public life. By the third or fourth generation, Hurrian might have been reduced to a heritage language used only in certain religious or family contexts. Archaeological evidence suggests that Hurrian continued to be used in some contexts even after the political collapse of Mitanni. Religious texts in Hurrian have been found at sites that remained important cultural centers. Some Hurrian vocabulary was borrowed into neighboring languages, preserving fragments of the linguistic system even as the language itself died out. But without the institutional support of a major kingdom, without schools or scribal traditions to maintain literary standards, without the social prestige that comes from being the language of power, Hurrian was fighting a losing battle. Languages need speakers, but they also need reasons for people to want to speak them. The final blow probably came with the various deportations and population transfers that were a standard part of Assyrian imperial policy. When Hurrian-speaking communities were broken up and relocated throughout the empire, mixed with speakers of other languages, the social networks that maintained language use were destroyed. It's a pattern we've seen repeated throughout history. Political conquest leads to linguistic pressure leads to language shift, and language shift eventually leads to language death. What makes Hurrian particularly tragic is that it was such a unique linguistic system. When it died, something genuinely irreplaceable was lost from human cultural diversity. Today, Hurrian exists only in the fragmentary texts that archaeologists have recovered, and the occasional borrowed word that survived in other languages. It's like trying to reconstruct a symphony from scattered sheet music pages and the memories of people who heard it performed decades ago. We can get a sense of what was there, but the full richness and complexity of the language, its poetry, its humor, its subtle ways of expressing complex ideas is lost forever. So, what was it like to live in Mitanni? Depends on who you were. If you were a Marianu, life was pretty sweet. Horses, weapons, respect. If you were a farmer, well, let's just say your biggest concern was less about chariot tactics and more about whether the barley harvest would be good enough to pay your taxes and not starve. It's the classic story, rich get richer, poor get farming. Mitanni society was structured like a pyramid, with the king at the apex and various layers of nobles, officials, warriors, craftsmen, farmers, and slaves below. But unlike some ancient societies where social mobility was theoretically possible through military service or commercial success, Mitanni seems to have been relatively rigid in its class distinctions, at least when it came to the highest levels of society. At the top sat the king, who bore titles that reflected both Hurrian and Indo-Aryan influences. The royal court was centered in Washukani, the capital city that continues to play hide-and-seek with archaeologists. We know it existed, we know it was important, but its exact location remains frustratingly elusive. It's like trying to find the ancient world's Atlantis, except this one definitely existed and probably wasn't underwater. Below the king came the Mariana warrior aristocracy who formed both the military backbone of the kingdom and its social elite. These weren't just soldiers, they were landowners, political advisors, and the primary interface between the royal administration and local communities. Their estates were worked by tenant farmers and slaves, generating the agricultural surplus that supported their expensive military lifestyle. The administrative apparatus of the kingdom required a substantial bureaucracy of scribes, judges, tax collectors, and various other officials. Many of these positions seem to have been hereditary, creating an administrative class that was distinct from, but closely associated with the warrior nobility. These were the people who kept the kingdom running on a day-to-day basis while the Marianu were off fighting wars or engaging in chariot racing. Craftsmen occupied a respectable middle position in society. Metalworkers who could produce high-quality bronze weapons and chariot fittings were particularly valued, as were the specialized artisans who created the luxury goods that the elite used to display their status. Potters who produced the distinctive Nutsi-ware ceramics, jewelers, textile workers, and carpenters all played essential roles in maintaining the material culture that defined Mitanni civilization. But the vast majority of the population were farmers, and their lives were hard. The agricultural surplus they produced supported everyone above them in the social hierarchy. They grew barley and wheat, tended flocks of sheep and goats, and paid taxes in both crops and labor service. When the kingdom went to war, it was the farmers who provided the infantry support for the elite chariot forces, and it was their communities that suffered most when those wars went badly. The truth is, life for the average Mitanni citizen probably wasn't dramatically different from life for farmers and craftsmen in neighboring kingdoms. You worked hard, paid your taxes, hoped for good harvests, and tried to stay out of the way when armies came through. The main difference was that your overlords happened to be chariot-riding Marianu instead of some other kind of warrior elite. These guys weren't just warriors, they had an economy to run. Think agriculture, lots of it, and trade. They were sitting on prime real estate, a Bronze Age Amazon distribution hub. And their pottery, oh man, Newsyware, it was the fancy designer dinnerware of its time. You knew someone was making it if they had Newsyware, like having a Smeg fridge today, but 3,500 years ago. The foundation of the Mitanni economy was agriculture, as it was for virtually every ancient society. The fertile plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers were ideal for growing the staple crops that fed the population and generated the surplus necessary to support the non-agricultural elite. Barley was the primary grain crop used both for human consumption and for feeding the horses that were so central to Mitanni military power. Wheat was also cultivated, though probably less extensively than barley. Various legumes, lentils, chickpeas, and field peas provided protein and helped maintain soil fertility through crop rotation. Date palms in the south provided fruit and syrup, while olives and grapes were grown in suitable microclimates. The agricultural calendar followed the rhythm of the seasons, with planting in the fall after the first rains, harvest in late spring, and a long, hot summer during which stored grain had to last until the next harvest. But agriculture alone couldn't support the complex society that emerged in Mitanni. The kingdom's location at the crossroads of major trade routes made it a natural hub for long-distance commerce. Tin from the mountains of eastern Anatolia moved south through Mitanni territory to supply the bronze-hungry civilizations of Mesopotamia. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan traveled west along routes that passed through Mitanni cities. Horses, the kingdom's premier export, were traded to Egypt, the Hittite kingdom, and other regional powers. The Mitanni developed a reputation for producing some of the finest horses in the ancient world, and this became a major source of both wealth and diplomatic influence. Egyptian pharaohs were willing to pay enormous sums for Mitanni breeding stock. A good war horse could cost as much as a house, and the Mitanni had the best. It was like being the only country in the world that could manufacture fighter jets. Everyone wanted what you had, and they were willing to pay top dollar for it. Craftsmen played a crucial role in the Mitanni economy, producing both utilitarian goods for local consumption and luxury items for trade and elite consumption. The most famous example is Newsyware, a distinctive style of painted pottery that has been found throughout the ancient Near East. These weren't just functional vessels, they were art objects decorated with intricate geometric patterns and stylized animal figures in red, black, and white paint. Newsyware pottery was the ancient equivalent of designer brands. It signaled sophistication, wealth, and cultural refinement. Finding Newsyware at archaeological sites tells us not just about trade networks, but about cultural aspirations and social hierarchies. It was the kind of thing that ambitious merchants in distant cities would acquire to show that they had connections to the sophisticated court culture of Mitanni. Metalworking was another crucial industry. Bronze weapons and tools required constant production and maintenance. The Mitanni developed sophisticated techniques for alloying copper and tin in the precise proportions needed for different applications. Chariot fittings, horse bits, arrow points, spearheads, and sword blades all required different metallurgical properties, and Mitanni smiths became renowned for their skill in producing exactly what was needed. Let's talk gods. The Hurrians had a crowded pantheon. Teshub the storm god was the big boss, think Zeus but with more Mesopotamian swagger. His wife Hepet was probably rolling her eyes a lot. And then there's Kamarbi Teshub's dad, whose family drama makes the Skywalkers look functional. We're talking castration with a sickle made of flint. Yeah, don't mess with Bronze Age gods. Seriously. Hurrian religion was a complex blend of indigenous traditions, borrowed elements from neighboring cultures, and the mysterious Indo-Aryan influences we've discussed. The pantheon was organized hierarchically, with Teshub the storm god at its head. Storm gods were popular throughout the ancient Near East, understandable in a region where agriculture depended entirely on seasonal rains and where storms could be both life-giving and destructive. Teshub was depicted as a powerful bearded figure, holding a bundle of lightning bolts and standing on a bull. His iconography shares elements with other storm gods throughout the region, the Mesopotamian Adad, the Canaanite Baal, and the later Greek Zeus. But Teshub had his own distinct personality and mythology that reflected specifically Hurrian cultural values and concerns. His consort Hepet was equally important in the pantheon. She was often depicted wearing a distinctive horned crown and holding a cup or bowl. Hepet seems to have been particularly associated with queenship and royal authority, which makes sense given the important role that queens played in Mitanni diplomacy and politics. Several Mitanni princesses who married foreign kings would have carried the worship of Hepet with them to their new homes. But the really wild stuff happens when you get into Hurrian mythology, particularly the stories involving Kamarbi, who was considered the father of the gods. The Song of Kamarbi is one of the most complete mythological texts we have in Hurrian, and it's absolutely bonkers. It tells the story of a succession of divine kings, each of whom is overthrown by his son in increasingly violent and bizarre ways. Kamarbi overthrows his father Anu by literally biting off and swallowing his genitals. This act of divine cannibalism results in Kamarbi becoming pregnant with several deities, including Teshub. The parallels with later Greek mythology, particularly the story of Cronus castrating Uranus and later being overthrown by Zeus, are so close that most scholars think the Greeks borrowed these stories from Hurrian sources, probably through Hittite intermediaries. And of course those Indo-Aryan gods just chilling in the VIP section of Mitanni treaties. Hey Teshub, mind if Indra crashes the party? It's a theological potluck. The presence of Mitra Varuna Indra and the Nisatya twins in official Mitanni religious contexts suggests that these deities weren't just exotic curiosities, but played real roles in the religious life of at least the elite classes. This religious syncretism, the blending of different religious traditions, was typical of ancient Near Eastern cultures, but the Mitanni seem to have been particularly open to incorporating foreign elements into their pantheon. It probably reflects the cosmopolitan nature of their society and their extensive diplomatic and trade contacts with distant regions. Religious festivals and rituals played important roles in maintaining social cohesion and royal legitimacy. Kings were expected to perform various ceremonies throughout the year, making offerings to the gods and ensuring divine favor for the kingdom. These events were also important social and economic occasions, bringing together people from across the kingdom and providing opportunities for trade, political networking, and cultural exchange. What about the arts? Their cylinder seals are like tiny, intricate graphic novels telling stories of gods and heroes. And music. We actually have what might be the oldest piece of notated music in the world, a Hurrian hymn. Imagine them vibing to that around a campfire. Okay, maybe not a campfire, probably a fancy royal court, but still ancient tunes. Mitanni artistic expression followed patterns established throughout the ancient Near East, but with distinctive local variations that reflect their unique cultural synthesis. Cylinder seals, small stone cylinders carved with intricate designs that could be rolled across clay to create impressions, were both functional administrative tools and miniature works of art. Mitanni cylinder seals often featured religious scenes, gods and goddesses in their traditional iconographic forms, mythological narratives, and ritual activities. But they also included secular scenes of daily life, hunting expeditions, and court ceremonies. The level of detail that skilled craftsmen could achieve on objects often less than 2 inches tall is remarkable. These weren't mass-produced items. Each seal was individually carved and represented a significant investment in artistic skill and materials. The seals also served as a form of personal identification and status symbol. High-ranking officials had elaborate seals with complex designs and high-quality workmanship. Lower-level administrators had simpler seals, but even these required considerable skill to produce. The iconographic program of a seal could communicate information about the owner's position, religious affiliations, and cultural loyalties. But perhaps the most remarkable artistic survival from the Hurrian cultural sphere is a musical composition, a hymn to the moon goddess Nikkel, found at the site of Ugarit in Syria. This text, written in Hurrian but discovered in a Canaanite context, includes what appears to be musical notation, making it potentially the oldest notated music in human history. The hymn itself is a devotional piece praising Nickel, who was associated with fruit trees and fertility. The musical notation system uses cuneiform symbols to indicate intervals and possibly melodic patterns. While scholars are still debating exactly how to interpret the notation, several attempts have been made to reconstruct and perform the piece. The results are hauntingly beautiful, a 400-year-old melody that gives us a direct connection to the aesthetic sensibilities of ancient Hurrian culture. Textile production was another important art form, though one that survives mainly through indirect evidence. Written sources mention richly decorated garments, particularly for royal and religious use. Trade records document the import of luxury materials, silk, precious dyes, gold thread that would have been used to create ceremonial costumes and decorative textiles. Architecture, unfortunately, is one of the areas where our knowledge of Mitanni culture is most limited. The failure to locate Washukani, the capital city, means we lack the kind of monumental architecture that tells us so much about Egyptian, Mesopotamian, or Hittite civilization. What we do know suggests that Mitanni cities followed typical Near Eastern patterns: fortified walls, palace complexes, temple precincts, and residential areas organized around central courtyards. The material culture that archaeologists have recovered, pottery, metalwork, jewelry, tools, shows a society that valued both functionality and aesthetic appeal. Even everyday objects were often decorated with geometric patterns or stylized animal figures. This suggests a culture where artistic expression was integrated into daily life, rather than being restricted to elite contexts. Alright, let's get into the international drama. First up, Egypt. Initially, it was like a schoolyard brawl. Pharaoh Thutmose III, the Napoleon of Egypt, kept trying to expand north, and Mitanni was like, "Not on our watch, buddy." Lots of dust-ups. The relationship between Mitanni and Egypt perfectly illustrates the complex, ever-shifting nature of ancient Near Eastern diplomacy. These weren't modern nation-states with fixed borders and clear sovereignty. They were expansionist kingdoms constantly testing each other's limits, forming temporary alliances, and switching sides based on immediate strategic needs. The conflict phase began during the reign of Thutmose III, one of Egypt's most successful military pharaohs. Around 1458 BCE, Thutmose launched a series of campaigns into the Levant, aiming to establish Egyptian hegemony over the wealthy city-states of Syria and Palestine. This put him on a direct collision course with Mitanni, which had its own interests in the region, and wasn't about to let Egypt expand unopposed into what they considered their sphere of influence. The Battle of Megiddo in 1457 BCE was the opening round of what would become a century-long struggle for control over the Levant. Thutmose faced a coalition of Canaanite city-states backed by Mitanni's support. His victory there established Egyptian dominance over southern Palestine, but it was just the beginning of a long and expensive series of campaigns. For the next several decades, Egyptian and Mitanni forces clashed repeatedly across the Syrian landscape. These weren't necessarily massive pitched battles, though those happened too, but often smaller engagements, sieges of fortified cities and raids designed to demonstrate power and extract tribute. Egyptian records describe numerous victories, but the fact that Thutmose had to campaign in the same areas year after year suggests that these victories weren't as decisive as Egyptian propaganda claimed. But then diplomacy. Suddenly they're besties, or frenemies with benefits. Mitanni princesses became Egyptian queens. King Tushratta of Mitanni was basically pen pals with Pharaoh Amenhotep III, sending letters like, "Hey, bro, send more gold." And by more, I mean a lot more. P.S. How's my daughter, your wife? Treat her right or else. The Amarna letters are pure gold, man. It's like reading ancient celebrity DMs. The transformation from enemies to allies happened gradually during the reigns of Thutmose IV and Amenhotep III. Both kingdoms were facing new threats. The rising power of the Hittite kingdom in Anatolia was becoming a concern for both Egypt and Mitanni. Rather than continuing to exhaust themselves fighting each other, they decided to join forces against the common threat. The diplomatic revolution was sealed with royal marriages. Thutmose IV married a Mitanni princess, establishing a precedent that would continue for generations. These weren't love matches, they were strategic alliances cemented by the most permanent diplomatic tool available: marriage ties, that created family relationships between the ruling dynasties. The correspondence between Tushratta and Amenhotep III provides an intimate look at how this alliance functioned in practice. These letters reveal a relationship that was simultaneously formal and personal, political and economic. Tushratta consistently addresses Amenhotep as "my brother," using the diplomatic language of equality between great kings, but the content makes clear that this was a relationship between unequal partners. Egypt was the wealthy partner in this alliance. Tushratta's letters are full of requests for gold, enormous quantities of gold. Egypt had access to the gold mines of Nubia, making it by far the richest kingdom in the region. Mitanni, for its part, offered horses military support and diplomatic partnerships. The letters document shipments of hundreds of horses along with chariots, weapons, and skilled craftsmen. But the relationship wasn't entirely one-sided. Egypt needed Mitanni as a buffer against Hittite expansion and as a source of military expertise. The Mitanni had perfected chariot warfare in ways that even the Egyptians admired and sought to emulate. Egyptian adoption of Mitanni horse training techniques and chariot designs shows that the influence flowed both ways. Those marriages weren't just vague political alliances either. We know the names of several Mitanni princesses who became Egyptian queens: Gilukhepa, daughter of Shutarna II, who married Amenhotep III, Tadukipa, daughter of Tushrada, who was sent to marry Amenhotep III, but probably ended up as a wife of his successor Akhenaten. These women brought Mitanni cultural practices, religious beliefs, and artistic traditions into the Egyptian court. While Mitanni was busy schmoozing with Egypt, a new power was rising in the north, the Hittites. And these guys were tough. Think of them as the stoic, iron-willed badasses of the Bronze Age. Their king Suppiluliuma. I try saying that 5 times fast after a few beers was a strategic genius and a major pain in Mitanni's royal behind. The Hittites emerged from the highlands of central Anatolia as a major power around the same time that Mitanni was establishing its dominance over northern Mesopotamia. This created an inherent conflict. Both kingdoms had expansionist ambitions, and their spheres of influence inevitably overlapped in the rich, strategically important region of northern Syria. Unlike the Egyptians, who were primarily interested in tribute and trade relationships, the Hittites were building a territorial empire. They wanted direct control over land and cities, not just influence and alliance relationships. This made them a fundamentally different kind of threat to Mitanni than Egypt had ever been. The Mitanni-Hittite rivalry was like the Lakers versus Celtics of the ancient Near East. Constant trash talk, backstabbing, and the occasional full-blown war. But it was also more than just a sports rivalry. It was a clash between different models of imperial organization and different cultural traditions. The Hittites had several advantages in this competition. They controlled Anatolia's rich mineral resources, particularly iron ore, which would eventually revolutionize military technology. They had a more centralized political system that could mobilize resources more efficiently than Mitanni's confederation of semi-autonomous city-states. And they had less geographic vulnerability. Anatolia's mountainous terrain provided natural defensive barriers that the open plains of northern Mesopotamia couldn't match. Suppiluliuma Amai, who ruled from roughly 1344 to 1322 BCE, was the Hittite king who finally tipped the balance decisively against Mitanni. He was a master of both military strategy and diplomatic manipulation, understanding that Mitanni's strength came from its alliance network and its reputation for military prowess. Rather than simply attacking Mitanni head-on, he systematically undermined both. Suppiluliuma's strategy involved multiple elements: direct military pressure on Mitanni's western territories, diplomatic efforts to detach Mitanni's allies and vassals, support for internal Mitanni political factions that might be sympathetic to Hittite interests, and careful timing to take advantage of Mitanni internal conflicts. The rivalry wasn't just about territory and tribute, it was also about prestige and recognition as a great power. In the diplomatic correspondence of the period, there was a clear hierarchy of kings. The great kings Egypt, Mitanni, Hatti, Babylon, and Assyria addressed each other as brother and exchanged gifts as equals. Lesser rulers were treated as vassals or allies. The Hittites wanted to establish themselves as the dominant power in their region, which meant reducing Mitanni from great king status to that of a subordinate ally or vassal. This competition played out not just on battlefields, but in the halls of other royal courts. Both kingdoms sent embassies to Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria, seeking support or at least neutrality in their conflicts. Marriage alliances, trade agreements, and mutual defense pacts all became weapons in a diplomatic war that was as important as the military campaigns. And if dealing with Egypt and the Hittites wasn't enough, there was another problem brewing to the east. Assyria. Initially, Assyria was like Mitanni's annoying little brother, but little brothers grow up. And this one grew up to be a military superpower that would eventually make everyone else look like chumps. Foreshadowing people. Heavy foreshadowing. Assyria's relationship with Mitanni began as one of clear subordination. During Mitanni's golden age in the 15th century BCE, Assyria was essentially a vassal state, paying tribute and providing military support when required. Assyrian kings acknowledged Mitanni's supremacy and operated within constraints set by Mitanni foreign policy, but Assyria had several inherent advantages that would eventually tip the balance in their favor. They controlled the wealthy commercial city of Ashur on the Tigris River, which had been a major trade center for centuries. They had access to agricultural resources from both the river valleys and the rain-fed uplands. Most importantly, they had a political culture that emphasized military expansion and the systematic exploitation of conquered territories. The Assyrian approach to empire was fundamentally different from Mitanni's, where Mitanni relied on alliance networks, prestigious marriages, and the loyalty of semi-autonomous vassals. Assyria developed a system of direct administrative control backed by overwhelming military force. They didn't just want tribute from their neighbors, they wanted to absorb them entirely into an expanded Assyrian state. This difference in imperial strategy became crucial as the regional balance of power shifted during the 14th and 13th centuries BCE. Mitanni's confederate system, which had been a source of strength when dealing with equals like Egypt and Hatti, became a vulnerability when facing an enemy that was willing and able to simply annex territory and deport populations. The first signs of Assyrian assertiveness came during the reign of Ashur-uballit I, who ruled from roughly 1365 to 1330 BCE. He began styling himself as a great king in correspondence with Egypt and other major powers, a clear challenge to Mitanni's traditional role as the dominant power in northern Mesopotamia. More ominously, he began expanding Assyrian territory at the expense of Mitanni vassals and allies. Assyrian military technology and tactics were evolving rapidly during this period. They were among the first to make extensive use of iron weapons, which gave them a significant advantage over enemies still relying primarily on bronze. They developed sophisticated siege techniques, including the use of battering rams, siege towers, and systematic approaches to reducing fortified cities. Most importantly, they created what was essentially the world's first professional army, a full-time military force that could campaign year-round and maintain pressure on enemies over extended periods. The psychological impact of Assyrian military methods was as important as their tactical effectiveness. The Assyrians developed a reputation for extreme brutality toward defeated enemies, systematically using terror as a weapon of war. Cities that resisted might see their populations slaughtered or deported, their buildings destroyed, and their agricultural infrastructure systematically ruined. This reputation often convinced potential enemies to surrender without fighting, which made Assyrian expansion even more efficient. Diplomacy back then was a trip. It wasn't just handshakes and treaties. It was a constant exchange of lavish gifts, gold, lapis lazuli, horses, women. Yes, women were diplomatic gifts. It's like, here's a treaty, and for your trouble a princess and 10 tons of barley. Wild times. Bronze Age diplomacy was a complex art form that combined elements of personal relationship building, economic negotiation, and military posturing. The surviving diplomatic correspondence from this period, particularly the Amarna letters and various Hittite archives, provides an intimate look at how international relations actually functioned in the ancient world. The language of diplomacy was highly formalized with specific terminology and protocols that had to be followed precisely. Kings addressed each other using carefully chosen titles that reflected their relative status and the nature of their relationship. My brother was used between equals, while my father or my son indicated hierarchical relationships. Getting the protocol wrong could cause serious diplomatic incidents. Gift exchange was the foundation of all diplomatic relationships. These weren't just ceremonial tokens, they were substantial transfers of wealth that served multiple functions. They demonstrated the sender's power and prosperity, they created obligations of reciprocity, and they provided tangible benefits to the recipient. A typical diplomatic gift might include gold jewelry, precious stones, fine textiles, exotic animals, skilled craftsmen, or beautiful women. The scale of some of these exchanges was enormous. Egyptian records describe gifts of hundreds of pounds of gold, entire herds of cattle, and shipments of luxury goods that would have required caravans of dozens of pack animals to transport. Receiving such gifts created an obligation to reciprocate at a similar level, which meant that maintaining diplomatic relationships was extremely expensive. Marriage alliances were the most important form of diplomatic relationship building. A royal marriage created permanent family ties between kingdoms that were expected to last for generations. Married princesses became ambassadors for their birth kingdoms, while also developing loyalty to their adopted home. Their children represented living symbols of the alliance between the two royal houses. But these marriages were also sources of potential conflict. Questions of protocol treatment of foreign wives and inheritance rights for children of mixed marriages could all become diplomatic issues. The correspondence between Tushratta and Amenhotep III includes several heated exchanges about the proper treatment of Mitanni princesses in the Egyptian court. The actual negotiation of treaties was a lengthy, complex process that might take years to complete. Preliminary negotiations would be conducted through ambassadors who carried extensive written instructions and had authority to make certain types of agreements. More complex issues would require direct correspondence between kings with multiple exchanges of letters before final terms were agreed upon. Treaty ceremonies were elaborate affairs designed to invoke divine sanction for the agreements being made. The gods of both kingdoms would be invoked as witnesses and guarantors of the treaty terms. Violation of a treaty wasn't just a political offense, it was a religious crime that would bring divine punishment on the offending party. What if Mitanni had managed to maintain a stronger, more consistent alliance with Egypt against the Hittites? Could they have survived? It's one of those tantalizing historical counterfactuals that keeps historians up at night. The alliance with Egypt was clearly beneficial to both parties, but it was also inherently unstable because it was based on the personal relationships between individual kings rather than permanent institutional structures. When those personal relationships change through death, internal political shifts, or changing strategic circumstances, the entire alliance structure could collapse with surprising speed. And that's exactly what happened as we move into the next phase of Mitanni's story, the internal conflicts that would ultimately destroy the kingdom from within. Remember King Tushratta, the guy writing all those letters to Egypt? Well, his end wasn't pretty. Probably got offed by one of his own sons. Classic royal drama. Suddenly Mitanni is plunged into a civil war. It's like Succession, but with more bronze daggers and less swearing. Okay, maybe just as much swearing. We just don't have the transcripts. The assassination of Tushratta around 1350 BCE marked the beginning of the end for the Mitanni kingdom as a major power. The exact circumstances of his death are unclear. Ancient sources are understandably vague about the details of royal murders, but the aftermath was catastrophic for the kingdom's stability and international standing. Tushratta had been a strong, if sometimes ineffective ruler who had maintained the alliance with Egypt and kept the kingdom together, despite increasing pressure from both the Hittites and the rising Assyrians. His death created a succession crisis that exposed fundamental weaknesses in the Mitanni political system. The problem was that Mitanni royal succession wasn't clearly defined by primogeniture or any other systematic principle. Like many ancient kingdoms, succession often went to the strongest, most capable, or most politically connected member of the royal family, not necessarily the eldest son. This system worked fine when there was a clear consensus about who should rule, but it became a recipe for civil war when there wasn't. Several of Tushratta's relatives had legitimate claims to the throne, and each had their own supporters among the Marianu elite and the kingdom's various city-states. The resulting conflict wasn't just a palace coup, it was a full-scale civil war that divided the kingdom and invited foreign intervention. The main contenders seem to have been Artadamatu, who may have been Tushratta's brother or cousin, and Shadowaza, who was definitely Tushratta's son. Artadamatu apparently gained control of the eastern territories of the kingdom, while Shadowaza held the west. Each claimed to be the legitimate king of all Mitanni, and each sought foreign support to make good on their claims. This internal division was exactly what Mitanni's enemies had been waiting for. Suppiluliuma, I must have been rubbing his hands with glee, like excellent, let them fight. The Hittite king had been looking for an opportunity to intervene decisively in Mitanni affairs, and the civil war provided the perfect excuse. The civil war also had immediate consequences for Mitanni's international relationships. Egypt, faced with competing claims from different Mitanni factions, effectively withdrew from active involvement in the region. The Egyptians had invested heavily in their relationship with Tushratta personally, and his death left them without a clear partner in Mitanni politics. Internal strife meant that the kingdom couldn't present a united front against external threats. Resources that should have been used for defense against the Hittites and Assyrians were instead devoted to fighting other Mitanni forces. The Marianu warrior elite, which had been the kingdom's primary military advantage, was divided against itself. The psychological impact was as important as the material damage. Mitanni had built its international reputation on strength, unity, and military prowess. The spectacle of Mitanni forces fighting each other undermined that reputation and encouraged enemies to become more aggressive while discouraging allies from providing support. And boy, did Suppiluliuma pounce. He marched his Hittite army right into Mitanni territory. Washukani, the capital. Sacked. The kingdom. Split in two like a Kit Kat bar. The western half became a Hittite puppet state. Ouch. That's gotta sting. Suppiluliuma's intervention in the Mitanni civil war was a masterpiece of opportunistic imperialism. Rather than simply supporting one faction or the other, he managed to manipulate the situation to achieve maximum advantage for the Hittite kingdom, while permanently weakening Mitanni as a rival power. The Hittite king's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. He offered support to Shadowaza Tushratta's son, but only on condition that Shadowaza accept vassal status under Hittite overlordship. This gave Suppiluliuma a legitimate claim to intervene in Mitanni affairs while positioning himself as a protector of legitimate royal authority rather than a foreign conqueror. The military campaign that followed was swift and devastating. Hittite armies supported by Shadiwaza's forces overwhelmed Artadamataku's faction and captured the major cities of western Mitanni. The fall of Washukani was particularly significant not just because it was the capital, but because it represented the symbolic heart of Mitanni power and identity. Imagine you're a citizen of Washukani. One day you're part of a proud empire that commands respect from Egypt and Assyria. The next foreign soldiers are marching down your streets, your king is a puppet, and your whole world has been turned upside down. It's the stuff of nightmares. The treaty between Suppiluliuma and Shadiwaza, preserved in the Hittite archives, reveals the extent of Mitanni's humiliation. Shadiwaza was allowed to keep the title of king, but only as a vassal ruler under direct Hittite supervision. He was required to provide military support for Hittite campaigns, to follow Hittite foreign policy, and to accept Hittite governors in key cities. More importantly, the treaty divided the Mitanni kingdom. The western territories, including the capital region, became the Rump Kingdom under Shatiwaza's rule. The eastern territories were apparently left to Artadama II and his successors, but without any central coordination or mutual support. The once unified kingdom was now two separate weakened entities, neither capable of independent action on the international stage. The economic impact was immediate and severe. The division of the kingdom disrupted trade routes, agricultural systems, and administrative structures that had taken generations to develop. Cities that had been connected by political and economic networks suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of a new international border. The Hittite occupation wasn't just a temporary military expedition, it was a permanent change in the regional balance of power. Hittite garrisons were established in key Mitanni cities, Hittite officials took over important administrative functions, and Hittite cultural and religious practices began to influence local traditions. For the Marianu warrior elite, the Hittite conquest was a personal catastrophe. Their status had been based on their role as the military backbone of an independent kingdom. As vassals of a foreign power, their prestige and influence were severely diminished. Some probably collaborated with the new regime, but others must have found themselves marginalized or displaced entirely. While the Hittites were busy in the west, remember Assyria, they weren't just sitting around, they saw their chance. The eastern remnants of Mitanni, now called Hanigalbat, tried to fight back, but the Assyrians were relentless. We're talking brutal campaigns. The Assyrians weren't known for their gentle touch, let's put it that way. The Assyrian approach to dealing with the Mitanni civil war was different from the Hittite strategy, but equally effective in its own way. Where Suppiluliuma had used diplomacy and manipulation to achieve his goals, the Assyrians relied on what they did best: overwhelming military force and systematic territorial annexation. Adad-nirari-Thurin, who ruled Assyria from roughly 1307 to 1275 BCE, was the king who finally ended Mitanni independence in the east. He was a methodical, relentless commander who understood that the key to permanent victory was not just defeating enemy armies, but destroying their capacity to resist in the future. If the Hittites were a strategic hammer, the Assyrians were a freaking wood chipper, and Mitanni was getting fed into it piece by piece. The Assyrian military machine was designed for conquest and annexation, not the kind of limited intervention that the Hittites had practiced in the west. Assyrian armies didn't just defeat Mitanni forces, they systematically destroyed the infrastructure that made organized resistance possible. Cities were besieged, captured, and often demolished. Agricultural areas were devastated to prevent them from supporting future military efforts. Populations were deported to other parts of the Assyrian Empire, breaking up the social networks that maintained local identity and resistance. The eastern Mitanni kingdom, now calling itself Hanigalbat to distinguish itself from the Hittite puppet state in the west, fought back with the desperation of a people facing extinction. They organized multiple rebellions against Assyrian rule, sometimes with support from other regional powers who were concerned about Assyrian expansion. But the Assyrians had several crucial advantages in this conflict. Their military was fully professional, meaning they could maintain continuous pressure on enemies throughout the campaigning season and across multiple years. They had superior siege technology, allowing them to reduce fortified cities that might have held out indefinitely against earlier forms of warfare. Most importantly, they had a systematic approach to territorial control that prevented defeated enemies from recovering and organizing new resistance. The Assyrian method of dealing with conquered territories was brutally effective. Instead of trying to govern through local elites as most earlier empires had done, they simply replaced local populations with Assyrian colonists or deportees from other conquered regions. This broke up ethnic and cultural continuities that might have formed the basis for future rebellions. Contemporary Assyrian records describe these campaigns with pride in their thoroughness and brutality. Kings boasted about the number of cities destroyed, the populations deported, and the tribute extracted from defeated enemies. This wasn't just propaganda. It was a calculated strategy to discourage resistance through the demonstration of overwhelming force. The final blow to eastern Mitanni came during the reign of Shalmaneser III, who ruled from 1274 to 1245 BCE. His campaigns in the region were so thorough that the name Hanigalbat disappears from historical records afterward. The eastern Mitanni kingdom simply ceased to exist as a political entity absorbed completely into the expanding Assyrian Empire. It wasn't an overnight collapse. It was a slow, painful bleed-out, like watching your favorite TV show get progressively worse each season until it's finally mercifully cancelled. Mitanni, once a great power, was reduced to an Assyrian province. The chariot lords were no more. The process of Mitanni's final dissolution took place over several generations, making it all the more tragic for the people who lived through it. Unlike some ancient kingdoms that fell in dramatic battles or sudden catastrophes, Mitanni died slowly, losing piece after piece of its identity, territory, and independence until nothing recognizable remained. In the west, Shadowy's puppet kingdom lingered on under Hittite supervision for several decades. His successors continued to bear the title King of Mitanni, but it was an increasingly hollow designation. Real power lay with Hittite officials and garrison commanders, while the local rulers became figureheads who performed ceremonial functions and provided a veneer of legitimacy for foreign rule. The cultural impact of this slow decline was profound. Hurrian language use declined as Hittite and Akkadian became the languages of administration and advancement. Traditional religious practices were modified or replaced by Hittite equivalents. The Marianu warrior class either died out or was absorbed into the Hittite military system, losing their distinctive identity in the process. In the east, the incorporation into the Assyrian Empire was more complete but also more violent. The Assyrians had no interest in maintaining even the fiction of local autonomy. Former Mitanni territories were reorganized into Assyrian provinces governed by appointed officials who answered directly to the Assyrian king. The Assyrian policy of population transfer meant that many former Mitanni subjects were forcibly relocated to other parts of the empire, while colonists from other regions were brought in to replace them. This broke up the social and cultural networks that had maintained Hurrian identity for centuries. Archaeological evidence from this period shows the material consequences of political collapse. Cities that had been prosperous centers of trade and craftsmanship became smaller, poorer, and less connected to regional networks. The production of luxury goods like nudie-ware pottery declined and eventually ceased entirely. Trade routes that had enriched Mitanni cities for centuries were redirected to serve Assyrian and Hittite interests instead. But perhaps the most poignant evidence of decline comes from the gradual disappearance of Hurrian from written records. Documents that had once been routinely produced in Hurrian were now written in Akkadian Hittite or Aramaic. The language that had once been a symbol of cultural sophistication and political independence became a relic spoken only in isolated rural communities. The final generation of people who remembered Mitanni as an independent kingdom must have watched this transformation with a mixture of grief and bewilderment. Within a single lifetime, they had seen their world completely transformed, their traditions marginalized, and their identity subsumed into vast foreign empires that cared nothing for Hurrian history or culture. By around 1200 BCE, the name Mitanni had effectively disappeared from political usage. The territories that had once made up the kingdom were now simply parts of larger Assyrian and Hittite provinces. The chariot lords who had once terrorized the battlefields of the ancient Near East were forgotten, their military traditions absorbed into the armies of their conquerors. So why isn't Mitanni as famous as Egypt or Rome? Part of it is they didn't leave behind giant Insta-worthy monuments. No Mitanni pyramids, no Colosseum of Washukani. Their capital is still playing hide-and-seek with archaeologists. It's like they were the ancient world's ninjas, powerful, influential, but incredibly good at disappearing. The obscurity of Mitanni in popular historical consciousness is one of those accidents of preservation and discovery that have shaped our understanding of the ancient world. Unlike Egypt with its massive stone monuments and arid climate that preserves organic materials, or Mesopotamia with its durable cuneiform tablets, Mitanni has left behind relatively few visible traces for modern audiences to latch onto. The failure to locate Washukani is particularly frustrating for archaeologists and historians. We know from textual sources that it was a major city, the political and cultural center of the kingdom, but despite decades of searching, its exact location remains unknown. This is partly because ancient cities in this region were often built primarily of mud brick, which erodes much more quickly than stone. Without the distinctive Tell's artificial hills created by successive layers of urban occupation that mark other ancient sites, Washukani has simply vanished into the landscape. This invisibility has real consequences for how we understand and remember ancient history. Visual impact matters enormously in how historical narratives are constructed and transmitted. The pyramids of Egypt, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the Parthenon of Athens. These monuments provide instantly recognizable symbols that connect modern audiences to ancient civilizations. Mitanni lacks such symbols, making it much harder for popular culture to grasp and remember. Just because they're obscure now doesn't mean they weren't a big deal then. They were. They shaped the geopolitical landscape of the Late Bronze Age in massive ways. For nearly 2 centuries, Mitanni was one of the great powers of the ancient Near East, mentioned in the same breath as Egypt, Babylon, and the emerging Hittite kingdom. Their diplomatic correspondence was conducted as equals with the most powerful rulers of their time. The Mitanni also suffered from the historical bias toward literate civilizations that left extensive written records. While they did produce texts, many were written on perishable materials or in archives that haven't survived. Much of what we know about Mitanni comes from the records of their neighbors Egyptian, Hittite, and Assyrian sources that naturally focus on their own perspectives and interests. There's also a temporal factor in Mitanni's obscurity. They flourished during what specialists call the Late Bronze Age, a period that's less familiar to general audiences than either earlier periods, like the rise of civilization in Mesopotamia, or later ones like classical Greece and Rome. The Late Bronze Age was a time of complex international systems and sophisticated diplomacy, but it lacks the clear narrative threads that make other periods easier to understand and remember. But they didn't vanish completely. Their culture left footprints. The Hittites basically binge-watched Hurrian mythology and rebooted it with their own spin. That whole Kamarbi castration story. The Greeks might have borrowed that for their Cronus and Uranus myth. So, in a way, Mitanni's stories are still with us, hiding in plain sight in other cultures' greatest hits. The transmission of Hurrian cultural elements to neighboring civilizations is one of the most fascinating aspects of their historical legacy. Culture, unlike political power, doesn't respect borders or survive only within the boundaries of specific kingdoms. Ideas, stories, artistic techniques, and religious practices can spread far beyond their points of origin, often in ways that are invisible to the people involved in the transmission. The Hittites were particularly enthusiastic adopters of Hurrian culture. This wasn't just casual borrowing, it was systematic cultural appropriation on a massive scale. Hittite archives contain hundreds of texts in Hurrian, including religious rituals, mythological narratives, and magical practices. Many of these texts were apparently translated into Hittite for use in official contexts, but others were preserved in their original Hurrian form, suggesting that knowledge of Hurrian was considered valuable in itself. The Song of Kamarbi and related Hurrian mythological texts had a particularly profound impact on subsequent literary traditions. The story of divine succession through violent overthrow, Kamarbi castrating Anu, then being overthrown in turn by Teshub, provided a narrative template that would be adapted and modified by later cultures throughout the region. The parallels with Greek mythology are so close that most scholars now accept that the Greeks acquired these stories through contact with cultures that had preserved Hurrian traditions. The Hesiodic account of the succession of the gods, Uranus overthrown by Cronus, Cronus overthrown by Zeus, follows the same basic pattern and includes many of the same specific details as the Hurrian versions. This kind of cultural transmission was probably facilitated by the movement of people as much as by the spread of texts. When kingdoms conquered new territories, they often incorporated local populations who brought their own cultural traditions with them. Marriage alliances, trade relationships, and diplomatic exchanges all created opportunities for stories, practices, and ideas to cross cultural boundaries. Religious syncretism was another major vector for the transmission of Hurrian cultural elements. Many Hurrian deities were adopted by neighboring peoples, often with modified names or attributes, but recognizable connections to their original forms. The goddess Shaushka, for example, was worshipped throughout the ancient Near East under various names, carrying with her distinctive iconographic and mythological associations that can be traced back to Hurrian origins. Artistic techniques and stylistic elements also spread far beyond the original boundaries of the Mitanni kingdom. The distinctive Nutsi-ware pottery style influenced ceramic traditions throughout the region. Hurrian iconographic elements, particular ways of depicting gods, animals, and ceremonial scenes were incorporated into the artistic vocabularies of multiple cultures. Even technological innovations associated with the Mitanni had lasting impacts. Their refinements in chariot design and horse training techniques were adopted throughout the ancient Near East and beyond. The Indo-Aryan horse training terminology that appears in Mitanni contexts was transmitted to other cultures, preserving linguistic elements that provide clues about ancient cultural connections. And that language, Hurrian, still a beautiful puzzle, and those Indo-Aryan whispers within it. That's a historical head-scratcher that keeps scholars up at night. It's a reminder that the ancient world was way more interconnected and surprising than we often give it credit for. The linguistic legacy of Hurrian is one of the most intriguing aspects of Mitanni's historical impact. As a language isolate with no known relatives, Hurrian represents a unique branch of human linguistic diversity that has been completely lost. Every extinct language represents the loss of a particular way of understanding and categorizing the world, but the loss of language isolates is especially tragic, because there's no closely related language that preserves similar structures or vocabulary. The grammatical features of Hurrian, its ergative-absolutive alignment, its complex system of verbal morphology, its distinctive patterns of noun incorporation represent linguistic solutions to communicative problems that developed independently from the patterns we see in better-known language families. Understanding these features helps linguists develop better theories about the range of possible human languages and the kinds of grammatical structures that human brains can acquire and use. But Hurrian's linguistic isolation also makes it incredibly difficult to study. When linguists work on languages within well-established families, they can use comparative methods to reconstruct earlier stages of development, predict likely sound changes, and fill in gaps in the attested data. With Hurrian, every analysis must be based solely on the limited corpus of surviving texts, making many questions about the language's history and development essentially unanswerable. The Indo-Aryan elements within Mitanni culture add another layer of complexity to this linguistic puzzle. The horse training terminology, divine names, and personal names that show clear Indo-Aryan connections suggest some kind of contact between Hurrian speakers and speakers of early Indo-Aryan languages, but the nature of this contact remains deeply mysterious. Was it the result of migration with Indo-Aryan speakers moving into the region and becoming integrated into Hurrian society? Was it cultural borrowing with Hurrian elites adopting Indo-Aryan practices and terminology for their prestige value? Was it the result of longer-term contact between populations that were geographically separated but maintained some kind of cultural exchange? Each of these scenarios has different implications for our understanding of ancient population movements, cultural exchange, and the development of Indo-European languages. The Mitanni evidence is some of the earliest clear attestation of Indo-Aryan linguistic elements, making it crucial for understanding the early history and dispersal of Indo-European speakers. Recent genetic studies of ancient populations in the region have begun to provide additional evidence that might help resolve some of these questions. DNA extracted from ancient burials can reveal patterns of population movement and genetic admixture that complement the linguistic and archaeological evidence. But the integration of these different types of evidence is still in its early stages, and many fundamental questions remain open. The study of Hurrian also contributes to broader questions about language contact, bilingualism, and cultural transmission in the ancient world. The multilingual nature of Mitanni society, with Hurrian as the primary language, Indo-Aryan elements in elite contexts, and Akkadian used for international diplomacy, provides a case study in how complex linguistic situations develop and evolve over time. This is where we play historical what if. What if Mitanni had managed to weather the storm? Could they have stopped the Assyrian juggernaut before it even got going? Would the map of the ancient Near East look completely different? It's fun to speculate, right? Makes you realize how much of history hinges on a few key moments, a few bad decisions, or just plain bad luck. Counterfactual history is always speculative, but it can be a useful tool for understanding the contingent nature of historical development and the importance of specific events and decisions. The collapse of Mitanni was the result of multiple intersecting factors, and it's worth considering how different outcomes might have changed the subsequent course of ancient Near Eastern history. What if Tushratta had not been assassinated, or what if the succession crisis had been resolved quickly without foreign intervention? A unified Mitanni might have been able to resist Hittite and Assyrian pressure more effectively. The kingdom's strength had always been based on its ability to coordinate the resources of multiple city-states and tribal groups under a single political system. Internal division fatally undermined this capacity, but a stable succession might have preserved it. What if the alliance with Egypt had been stronger and more consistent? Egyptian military support might have tipped the balance in Mitanni's favor during the crucial conflicts of the 14th century BCE, but this would have required a level of strategic coordination that the ancient world rarely achieved. Communication delays, competing priorities, and the personal nature of royal relationships made sustained long-distance alliances inherently fragile. What if Mitanni had developed different military technologies or tactical innovations? Their dominance had been based on chariot warfare, but this advantage was inherently temporary. Infantry techniques were improving, iron weapons were becoming more common, and siege warfare was becoming more sophisticated. A Mitanni that had adapted more quickly to these changes might have remained competitive for longer. Perhaps most intriguingly, what if the Indo-Aryan elements in Mitanni culture represented a larger population or cultural movement? If there had been more extensive connections between the ancient Near East and the Indo-Iranian world, the entire pattern of cultural and technological development might have been different. The early introduction of horse domestication, chariot technology, and Indo-European religious concepts might have accelerated developments throughout the region. The survival of Mitanni might have prevented or delayed the rise of Assyrian hegemony over the ancient Near East. The Assyrian Empire was built on the systematic absorption of smaller kingdoms and the elimination of potential rivals. A strong Mitanni might have provided a counterbalance that forced the Assyrians to develop different strategies or limited their expansion in certain directions. Different outcomes in the ancient Near East might have had cascading effects throughout the ancient world. The Bronze Age collapse that occurred around 1200 BCE was partly the result of the destabilization caused by Assyrian expansion and the disappearance of older diplomatic systems. A different balance of power might have led to a more stable transition to the Iron Age, but it's also important to recognize the limits of such speculation. The forces that brought down Mitanni: technological change, population pressure, environmental challenges, and the inherent instability of Bronze Age political systems were larger than any single kingdom could control. Even a Mitanni that had avoided the specific crises of the 14th century BCE might have faced similar challenges from different directions. There's something undeniably romantic, almost melancholic, about a lost civilization. Mitanni is a ghost at the banquet of ancient history. They remind us that even the greatest empires can fade. Their languages can fall silent. Their cities can return to dust. It's a humbling thought. The fascination with lost civilizations taps into deep human anxieties about impermanence, forgotten achievements, and the fragility of cultural memory. Mitanni represents something that many people find both attractive and troubling: the possibility that entire ways of life can simply disappear, leaving behind only fragmentary traces for future generations to puzzle over. This appeal is particularly strong in our current historical moment, when rapid technological and social change makes many people feel that their own cultures and traditions are under threat. The story of Mitanni serves as both a cautionary tale about the consequences of political division and external pressure, and a reminder that cultural influence can persist long after political power has disappeared. The partial nature of our knowledge about Mitanni also contributes to its allure. Mystery is often more compelling than complete understanding. The gaps in our knowledge allow room for imagination and speculation in ways that fully documented civilizations do not. We can project our own interests and concerns onto the shadowy outlines of Hurrian culture in ways that would be impossible with better-known civilizations. There's also something appealing about the underdog status of Mitanni in the hierarchy of ancient civilizations. They were clearly important and influential in their own time, but they've been overshadowed by the more famous empires that survived longer or left more visible remains. This creates a natural sympathy for their historical position and a desire to restore their proper place in our understanding of the ancient world. The linguistic isolation of Hurrian adds another dimension to this appeal. Language is so fundamental to human experience that the complete loss of a linguistic system feels like a profound form of death. The knowledge that there were once people who thought, felt, and expressed themselves in ways that are now completely inaccessible to us is both fascinating and melancholy. But the appeal of lost civilizations can also be problematic if it leads to romantic fantasizing rather than serious historical understanding. The real Mitanni was a complex society with its own forms of inequality, violence, and limitation. Romanticizing them as a lost golden age or a more authentic way of life ignores the historical realities of Bronze Age existence. The most valuable lesson from studying civilizations like Mitanni is not that we should mourn their passing, but that we should appreciate the diversity and contingency of human cultural development. Every society represents a unique experiment in how humans can organize themselves, understand their world, and create meaning through shared institutions and practices. The disappearance of Mitanni reminds us that no cultural achievement is permanent, but it also demonstrates that influence and legacy can persist in unexpected ways long after political power has vanished. The stories, technologies, artistic techniques, and religious concepts that originated in Hurrian culture continued to shape the ancient world for centuries after the kingdom itself had disappeared. So there you have it, the kingdom of Mitanni, chariot warriors, lost language, royal drama, and a whole lot of wait what moments. Pretty wild, huh? From their meteoric rise as masters of chariot warfare to their slow fade into the footnotes of history, it's a story that's both epic and kind of tragic. The unvarnished truth. They were a major power, a linchpin in the complex machine of late Bronze Age politics. They went toe-to-toe with pharaohs, battled Hittite kings, and left behind a linguistic puzzle that still fascinates us. And they're Marianu warriors. You definitely wouldn't want to be on their bad side. Talk about a rough day at the office if you saw those chariots cresting the hill. What's the takeaway here? Well, for one, it definitely makes you appreciate your Wi-Fi, your DoorDash, and the fact that your biggest international crisis is usually just a delayed Amazon package, not an impending Hittite invasion. Perspective, people. Perspective. But on a more serious note, the story of Mitanni is a classic reminder: nothing lasts forever. Empires rise and fall. Languages are born and die. It also shows how interconnected the ancient world was. These guys weren't living in isolated bubbles. They were trading, fighting, marrying, and influencing each other in ways we're still uncovering. And that whole Indo-Aryan thing, it just proves that history is full of surprises. The moment you think you've got it all figured out, bam, Vedic gods show up in a Mesopotamian treaty. Keeps things interesting, doesn't it? The Mitanni story also illustrates something important about how we remember the past. Fame and historical preservation don't always correlate with actual historical importance. Sometimes the most influential civilizations are the ones that get forgotten, while others that left impressive monuments but had less impact get all the attention. Mitanni was clearly a major player in their time, shaping the political and cultural landscape of the ancient Near East in ways that echoed for centuries. Their military innovations changed how wars were fought throughout the region. Their diplomatic practices helped establish the protocols and expectations that governed international relations for generations. Their cultural achievements influenced art, religion, and literature far beyond their original borders. Yet because they didn't build pyramids or leave extensive written records, they've become the ancient world's great forgotten empire. There's also a lesson here about the fragility of cultural memory. The Hurrian language, with its unique grammatical structures and vocabulary, represented thousands of years of human linguistic evolution. When it died out, we lost not just a communication system, but an entire way of organizing and understanding human experience. The same was true of Hurrian religious practices. Artistic traditions and social institutions each represented unique solutions to universal human problems. But the story isn't entirely one of loss and disappearance. Cultural influence has a way of persisting even when political power vanishes. The stories that Hurrian bards told around Bronze Age campfires eventually made their way into Greek mythology, and from there into the broader tradition of Western literature. The horse training techniques developed by Mitanni specialists influenced military practices throughout the ancient world. The diplomatic innovations pioneered in Mitanni courts helped establish international law and protocol that persisted for millennia. So what do you guys think? What part of the Mitanni story blew your mind the most? Was it the chariot tech, the lost language, the crazy royal politics, or the fact that they just kinda disappeared? Let me know in the comments below. I read them all, even the ones correcting my pronunciation of ancient Hurrian names, which, fair enough, is probably atrocious. For me, I think what's most striking about the Mitanni is how they represent both the possibilities and the limitations of human achievement. They built something remarkable, a sophisticated political system that balanced local autonomy with central coordination, a military machine that dominated battlefields for centuries, a cultural synthesis that brought together influences from across the known world. But they also shows how quickly even the most impressive achievements can be undone by a combination of internal division, external pressure, and historical contingency. Their story is a reminder that we're all part of a much larger historical flow, that the civilizations we take for granted are more fragile than they appear, and that the cultures we create today will eventually seem as remote and mysterious to future generations as Bronze Age Mitanni seems to us. Alright folks, that's our deep dive for tonight. Thanks for hanging out with me and exploring the world of the Mitanni. Hope you learned something new, or at least found a new ancient empire to obsess over. I know I did again. If you've made it this far, you're a true history aficionado, or maybe you've just drifted off into a peaceful chariot-filled slumber. Either way, mission accomplished. Got any ideas for future deep dives? What other forgotten corners of history should we illuminate? The Sea Peoples and their mysterious Bronze Age rampage. The Elamites and their stubborn resistance to Mesopotamian imperialism. The Kushites and their conquest of Egypt. Drop your suggestions below. Until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and try not to get conquered by your neighbors. And remember, the next time someone tells you that history is boring, just remind them about chariot-driving warrior aristocrats who spoke a lost language and worshipped gods borrowed from ancient India while conducting diplomacy with Egyptian pharaohs through marriage alliances and massive gold shipments. History isn't boring, it's just waiting for the right storyteller to bring it back to life. Sweet dreams.